Thank you, Marcel. If we look at global greenhouse gas emissions, we see that they continue almost an unabated rise upward. At the end of this graph, which ends in 2020 or so, there's a little bit of downtick due to the pandemic, but be assured that the world has made that up already in the past 2 years. And most of the world is fixed on trying to take this curve to zero, net zero, over the next 30 years to, quote, avoid the worst effects of climate change. And there are some representative trajectories there from a UN report as to what it would take to do that. For this talk, I'm not going to question the need to do this. We had a lot of discussion about that yesterday when I spoke, but we're going to talk about whether this is in fact possible or not. As I discussed yesterday, whatever the world does has got to strike a balance between what climate science tells us, the world's growing demand for reliable, affordable, clean energy, and taking into account various societal factors, including the efficacies and costs of whatever it is we do. Last night I spent most of the time talking about the left-hand side, the climate science story. Today it's going to be on the right-hand side and in the middle. What do we do if one really wants to try to reduce emissions in a significant way? I'm going to take a physicist's approach. It was wonderful to hear from Theo and Alexander how Holland and Germany are trying to strike this balance. I'm going to look at this more like a physicist. You know, in physics, we have a couple of broad principles they're called laws, and while they don't determine the solution, they condition the solution in the sense that the solution has to respect them. Conservation of energy, the second law of thermodynamics, and so on. You can't break those. Similarly, there are certain statements about energy that maybe are not quite as rigorous, but are almost that, and anything that a country does has got to respect them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the constraints. We already have heard specifics about them in particular countries. There's going to be a strong growth over the next 30 years in energy demand, driven mostly by development, not by population growth. Second, if we look at the climate science, the benefits of decarbonization are vague. They are distant in time, decades hence, and uncertain. Whereas the disbenefits of decarbonization are certain and immediate if you don't have the reliable and affordable energy that fossil fuels bring. Energy systems, which is what we're talking about changing, are critical. They touch everything in society. They're also resistant to change. They're recalcitrant. It's really hard to change them on anything less than a multi-decadal timescale. Energy systems that are low emission or zero emission are currently more costly than fossil fuel systems. And finally, as we try to strike that balance, there is an optimal pathway that involves technology development, economics, regulation, climate risk, behavior, and so on. I want to start off with the notion that, in fact, there is an optimal pathway. This is a figure from Nordhaus's Nobel lecture in 2018. And it shows various trajectories of temperature rise, depending upon the base case. If you look at the optimum, which is the orange line and so on, the optimality is achieved by, if you decarbonize too rapidly, you're too disruptive and you deploy immature technologies. If you decarbonize too slowly, the temperature rises up with perhaps unintended bad consequences. The particulars of these curves depend on what you assume about technology development, discount rate, development and all of that. I'm not going to favor one or the other of these, and people have questioned the different assumptions that go into these curves, but there is an optimum. And I would assert that right now we're moving too rapidly, as I'll try to show you. So let's look at the future, and the future of energy, which I'll call FOE for short, is more right now. As I said, that's driven by population and development. These are slightly different versions of some of the charts I showed last night. This is global population out to 2050. It's, of course, a projection, but one strikes one here is the strong growth, first of all, in Africa at the bottom of the chart, and then in, you can't see the cursor, okay, and then in Asia as well. At the same time, if you plot energy use per capita versus GDP per capita, I showed this chart last night, what you see is that for the half of the world that is down below $10,000 per capita, so the lower part of this chart over here, their energy use goes up universally with economic development. And it turns out, one of the research projects I'm intrigued with, it's about 5 megajoules per dollar. And more or less the same for all countries. Why is it 5 megajoules per dollar? I don't think anybody really knows. Why isn't it not 50 or 0.5? It's the kind of regularity that intrigues a physicist. If we can understand that, you might be able to modulate energy growth going forward as those countries develop. So it's one of the mysteries. Anyway, combine that development together with the population growth, and what you get is a 50% increase in energy, most of it in Asia, but a growing fraction in Africa as well, and not so much in the OECD countries. Okay. A lot of the decarbonization strategies move toward everything electric, vehicles, building heat, industrial heat, and other electrical uses. And I like to talk about the grid's troubled triangle. Other people talk about the trilemma. We would like our electricity to be clean, we'd like it to be affordable, and you would like it to be reliable. And the problem is, it's kind of hard to have all three of these things at once. If you want to be affordable and reliable, we've got coal and gas, and we're not running out of any of those at all. So they're there. Known technologies, works fine. If you want to be affordable and clean, we've got wind and solar, although the price of those renewables is going up as the world uses more of them, and the bill of materials becomes more expensive. And if you want to be clean and reliable, we've got storage technologies, we've got fission and carbon capture. If you want to build an entirely green grid, you can put in a lot of wind and solar, but the biggest cost, as I'll show you in a second, and we've heard a bit already this morning for Teo, the biggest cost is not generation, but it's reliability. It's the backup system. And so how we square or fill in that triangle is the problem that everybody's wrestling with. Now, I want to show you some data that illustrates the problem. This is a graph of daily wind generation over 6 months at the end of 2020 into 3 months into 2021. And what you see is that there are long periods, Dunkelflauten, where the wind is just not producing. And you therefore need a backup system. This phenomenon is not unknown in other other regions that have high renewable penetration. In Texas, the summer months are largely becalmed. And in California, you've got the same problem. And to quantify that, I refer to a calculation that was done by my friends Ken Caldera then at Carnegie and now at the Breakthrough Institute, and Nate Lewis, who's a former colleague at Caltech, together with Jackie Dowling. And what they did, and it plays nicely on what Dale was talking about, they took across the entire U.S., county by county, the wind and solar every hour for 40 years. So got that data, good meteorological data. They also took the hourly demand for 40 years for electricity. And they asked what deployments of wind and solar, irrespective of where you would put it in optimal locations, and not taking into account the cost of transmission lines. So in some ways, this is the best case. How much wind, solar, storage, and so on do you need in order to guarantee that you meet the demand 99.99% of the time, which is about the federal standard in the US. And then you go through an optimization under different constraints, only natural gas plus solar plus wind and so on. And the results are kind of surprising. If you're only natural gas, you're down at about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, $60 a megawatt hour. If you want to do natural gas with CCS plus solar and wind, you're up at about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear, or what they are, power to gas to power, PGP, is taking the electricity from the renewables or excess in any given time, turning it into hydrogen gas, and then turning it back again into electricity. As we heard, not a very efficient way of storing things. And as you go into grids that are solar only, or wind and solar, what you see is that the costs are higher. And so, as we heard this morning, you wind up running at least 2 grids, which is at least twice as expensive. This kind of optimization, I know as of a year or 2 ago, was underway in the UK, that kind of modeling. I don't know whether it's been done in Holland yet, but it could be, and it's kind of an interesting guide as to what a future grid would look like and how much it would cost. Renewables are the current fixation of many people, but they have their drawbacks. Apart from the intermittency and the stability problems, it turns out that they are very land intensive. That's not a surprise, perhaps. Renewable energy, whether it's wind or sunlight, is very diffuse. And so you need a lot of area in order to collect enough of the energy. And this chart, which is from one of the government agencies in the US, I guess, shows the land use intensity, square kilometers per terawatt hour per year of various technologies. And you can see that wind uses, almost 10 times as much as coal or solar thermal, and so on. Right? So there are land issues. There are also, as was alluded to briefly, materials issues as well. So because the modern energy technologies strive to be very efficient, they get to use a lot of fancy materials, not only copper and lithium, which are perhaps pretty familiar, but the rare earths, molybdenum, graphite, silicon, and so on. And you can see in the upper 2 bars that shows how many kilos per vehicle are used by an electric car versus a conventional car. It's a factor of 7 times more stuff. And if you look at power generation, again, offshore wind, onshore wind, PV, nuclear, natural gas, and so on, there's a factor of 9. Okay? So it's a very different kind of construction. And the downside of this is not only are the materials different, but there are new supply chains that need to be built. Because, in fact, if you look at where the current fossil fuels come from, the extraction and the processing on the left and then on the right, there are a certain set of countries that produce oil and gas, coal. But if you look at the minerals, it's a whole other set of countries. And unfortunately, at least for those of us living in the US, a lot of the processing, most of it, is done in China. And that is not a healthy geopolitical situation for the US. And so you see efforts in the Inflation Reduction Act to try to onshore or at least friendshore a lot of these minerals to the US. The energy transition is not without its downsides. Let me talk a little bit about what the future energy systems might look like. Niels Bohr said it pretty well. Yogi Berra could have said that also, I think. Anyway, as one does these projections, the challenge is to be not so specific as to be very likely wrong, but at the same time not so general as to be useless. And I'll try to strike that balance, and I'll give you my take on the future of energy with a 30-year time horizon, focusing on these fundamentals, as I mentioned. So the future is going to be dominated by fossil fuels. We're 80% fossil fuel now by the world. Not going to change much as we go forward. Maybe 75 or 70 over the next 30 years. If you assume current policies, as the US EIA does, no great changes, then what you see is that energy use grows, as I said, by about 50%. Most of that growth from fossil fuels, some growth from renewables, and we saw that already in some of the charts that were shown this morning. The second is that the future of energy is going to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. The priorities, as the Ukraine has shown everybody, is that reliable comes first, affordable second, and clean third, as the world thinks about its energy sources. People forget that energy is provided by complicated systems that have been tuned to be highly reliable and efficient, and it takes years, decades to get the hardware and operating systems right. So don't mess with it lightly. And we've also seen that energy systems change slowly. There are fundamental reasons why they change slowly. People who, in Silicon Valley, where I have spent a bit of time recently, everybody thinks we can change this with the same speed that we change phone technology or computing. And it's just not like that at all. Large capital investments that last a long time, the need for interoperability, the fact that there are many stakeholders means things don't change very rapidly. And so, again, this chart of US energy sources and the way it changes so slowly is kind of sobering. If you're going to try to make it change more rapidly, then you're going to get a backlash. And we've already heard about the boilers in Germany and the internal combustion engine bans and all those things that touch consumers. People are not going to change all that rapidly. The future of energy is also continued greenhouse gas emissions, but as I explained last night, and Quintel keeps saying, truthfully, it's not a climate catastrophe. Here's the greenhouse gas emissions going up again. Net zero by 2050, as Theo said, I think, is a fantasy. And by 2100, it is unlikely. We're not going to do that. The reason you can see it's a fantasy, I think even John Kerry has said as much, is that the stated goal for China to go net zero is 2060, and for India maybe 2070 is what they're talking about. So that's already past 2050, and that's just what they say they're going to do. In reality, you can bet that they're going to do much less. And so even if the developed world goes to zero by 2050, net zero globally is a fantasy. Adaptation is going to dominate over mitigation. We will learn how to adapt, and as I discussed in more detail last night, we're pretty good at it. This guy, Anthony Downs, beyond talking about the rich-poor gap, also talked about an issue attention cycle for ecological problems. Phase one is where the issue bubbles along without much profile among experts. Phase two is where it bursts into public consciousness with a great enthusiasm for solving it. Phase three, everybody realizes just how hard it's going to be to solve it. Phase four, attention tapers off. You leave behind some institutions. No doubt there will be NGOs associated with carbon emissions and regulations and so on, but public attention will fade as the difficulty becomes evident. And then it might get redefined into some other problem: local pollution, plastics, artificial intelligence, who knows what. So, I don't think it's a given that this is going to happen, but I think it is not an unlikely future over the next 10 years. Again, particularly as the regulations start to impact ordinary people's pocketbooks or freedom of choice. And my hope is that when that happens, there will be a greater scrutiny of the science. Innovation. The future of energy will involve more graceful innovation. I showed this cartoon last night, the energy realities are becoming more apparent to non-experts. And one of the things that struck me as I listened to both Alexander and Theo talk this morning is you could have realized all of those problems 20 or 30 years ago if you had studied the issue to some extent. They were known to experts. Why did the world start down that path? And it's only now that the leadership is starting to acknowledge those problems. I think that is a fundamental issue of how technical input gets delivered to non-technical decision makers. Lots of realities. Yeah, I don't know how it is in Holland or in Germany. If you look at the Public Utility Commission in California, which is the regulatory body that governs electricity in California, or the same thing in New York, or maybe not Texas so much, the technical voice is entirely absent at that table, right? Because you're perceived to have vested interests. And that's why we are getting into such trouble. The experts are afraid to speak up. The leadership of the utility companies are afraid to speak up because they get canceled. When you sit and talk to them in private, they'll acknowledge everything we've heard, or I'm saying right now. But we're watching things go over a cliff as Wile E. Coyote has gone. So the realities for me are the relative size of the developed and developing worlds. Holland is 0.5% of global emissions. If you all went to zero tomorrow, that's 4 months of growth in the rest of the world. Gets canceled out. Reliability and affordability and local pollution are much more important issues than greenhouse gas reductions. Energy systems are recalcitrant. The need for regulatory stability is really important. Energy changes slowly. If the regulations change too rapidly on the political time scale, you're very inefficient. This was recognized already by the people who developed the U.S. government, the founding fathers. There's a wonderful set of essays, for those of you who may not know American history, called the Federalist Papers. And it was James Madison and Alexander Hamilton writing one to the other in short essays about the structure of the upcoming U.S. government. And in Federalist Paper number 62, you've got Madison arguing for a U.S. Senate that changes more slowly than the U.S. House of Representatives. We have 6-year terms in the Senate, 2-year terms in the House. And one of the reasons he gives is something like, and I won't get the quote exactly right, what businessman would hazard his fortunes on government regulation that could change at a whim? And therefore we need more stability in the government. Same problem here. I think people also need to realize that the invention of energy technologies, the manufacture of them, and the deployment of them are 3 separate activities. And so if you advocate as a politician for energy innovation, that's great, but you may see the jobs go elsewhere. And we're seeing that now almost in real time with the problems with automakers and auto labor in the US. Solar panels are another great example, right? Manufactured in China, invented largely in the US, and deployed all over the world. All right. We have in the US a lot of confusion about the role of government versus the private sector in innovation. And I think that's going to clarify. The Inflation Reduction Act did some of that. But also the government is starting to realize it cannot subsidize to scale. $7,500 tax credit for each car, electric car bought. You multiply that by 10 million cars a year, and that's a lot of money even in Washington. So you cannot subsidize to scale. There will be some technological surprises, guaranteed. Okay. Let me talk about, get out on a limb a little bit and get to some specifics over the next 30 years. Global coal is going to keep going up. We've got record consumption in India this year and near record consumption in China. China's building coal plants like crazy. They need the energy. Eventually it will decline as other better sources become available, but for the next decade or so, I think it's going to go up. Natural gas will go up. It is the fuel of choice in many ways. It's clean in a local pollution sense. It's abundant in many countries. You have it here in Europe, in Holland, but somehow you shut down Groningen, right? What? You wonder what people are thinking, right? So instead, you're importing it from the U.S., Germany to LNG. Sorry? By ship, yeah, right. With loss of energy associated with it. Okay. Hydrogen, for me, is a big question mark. I think hydrogen for vehicles is a non-starter. The best way to carry hydrogen is hooking up to a carbon atom. And if you don't like carbon, well, nitrogen is not so bad either. Ammonia is pretty good fuel. I think power to gas to power is a possible use for hydrogen, but otherwise it's not so good. It leaks too easily. I think we will see the electrification of most uses. I think if you look out 20 years, light-duty vehicles, passenger cars, light trucks will be largely electrified, although not completely. Heat pumps in temperate climates. I wrote this chart before. I lived for a while in a California apartment with a heat pump. I'm not a fan of them now at all. They're pretty finicky and not very effective if it gets cold, but all right. On the generation side, wind and solar are going to grow, but I have said in the past 80%, no more than that because of reliability issues. Maybe it's even less than that. I would defer to grid experts as to how far they think we'll get to. Fission's going to grow outside the U.S. If we want to decarbonize, nuclear power is going to be an important part of the future. I like small reactors rather than the big ones. We have a discussion with Theo about the relative merits of one or the other. Fusion is going to work in the sense that we will be able to get enough gain to make it plausible physically, but there are two main barriers, I think, that have not really been addressed yet. One is for magnetic fusion, the first wall. So what do we make the containment vessel out of that doesn't get chewed up after a month by the radiation and particle flux from the plasma? The second, which is for both inertial and magnetic, is where are you going to get the tritium from? Right? You can make it work, but may not have the fuel. So right now, the world's stock of tritium is 50 kilos total. And it's disappearing. Half of it disappears every 12 years. So you got to keep making it. And we make enough to maintain the stock. 1 gigawatt power plant running for a year will use about 10 times as much. Just one plant. So the hope is that these, like ITER, or the next generation after ITER, will make its own tritium by exposing lithium to the neutrons that come out of the plasma. But nobody has demonstrated the ability to do that at scale. Right now we make tritium in kilo quantities. You need to do this in 100 kilo quantities. So that's something, the work to have fusion work and run out of fuel, or not have the fuel available. Got to start thinking about that now. I think the grid is going to mature. Informatics, two-way flow of information. The distribution infrastructure is going to be bolstered as we start charging up more things at home. 4 houses on a 17 kVA transformer charging up all at once will stress the distribution infrastructure. Supply chains, especially critical materials, they are already being bolstered, multiple sources. New sources of supply, we're looking at lithium brine in the US as a way of getting lithium. And then finally, new waste streams. Right? Turbine blades after the turbines have gone, batteries after the batteries go bad, solar panels, spent fuel, and so on. Right? So that's a little bit of my sense of where things are going to go in the future. I'll close with the definition from Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. That period of time in which our affairs prosper, our friends are true, and our happiness is assured. I think there is good reason for optimism, but not for the reason that most people think. So happy to take comments and questions at that point, and thanks for your attention.